were considered Negroes due to Indian slavery. In 1682, Virginia created an act that Native Americans and Africans who were not in enmity with the government would be called Negroes. South Carolina adopted that and came up with the Negro law. And the Indians in South Carolina, who were not in enmity with the government, became slaves. And that's my story. I am on my father's side. I can account for my genealogy for 11 generations. And that's 11 generations of Yuchi Indians. On my mother's side, I can account for 9 generations. My mother and father are related. That's something that happens in Native American families, and it happens in ours. So what I'm going to start telling you about is 4 important women I had in my life growing up. One was my Aunt Laura. She lived to be 114 years old. Next, my great-grandmother, Ethel Langley, lived to be 87. Third, my Aunt Susie. Last, my grandmother that raised me from 3 days old. And when my mother, and I call her Mama, gave me this journey, I didn't want it. I'm an engineer, I love traveling, I don't want this. My mom told me, do you know what is in store for you? Do you know? I said, no. She said, look, I ain't leaving you no money. You got this legacy. I am placing it in your hands. And when you tell people, don't sugarcoat it, don't make it bitter, tell it exactly the way it is. So I'm standing here today to tell you the story of the Yuchi Indians of the Savannah River. I'm going to start with my great-grandmother, Mariah. And her name was Mariah Mati. And she became a Cummings. But when she was a little girl, about 7 years old, her village in Mill Haven was raided. See, the Yuchi Indians has been on the Savannah River for over 1,000 years. So information that I give you, I'm giving you information that is not told in the history books, but you can find in the archives. History for the longest time has been suppressed and omitted. And my thing has been, as a genealogist, when I was digging into colonial records, I started as a genealogist as a hobby. But the more information I found, I began to dedicate myself and start looking at it from a forensics perspective. So my grandmother, Mariah, was on a slave auction block, and they was getting ready to sell her. But there was a missionary named John Wesley. And John Wesley had a disciple named Francis Asbury. Francis Asbury's disciple purchased my grandmother, Mariah. Having him purchase her and gave her her freedom, she dedicated her life then to Christianity, which brings about Asbury AME Church in Sylvania, Georgia, was started by the Yuchi Indians and free Africans. That's that side of the story of my grandmother. So my grandmother, she lived to be 100 years old. And her daughter, Angeline, only had one child, Rosa. and Rosa only had 2, my grandmother. So the women in our family had longevity, but they didn't have a lot of children. Now, my Aunt Laura was my grandmother that raised me from 3 days old, grand aunt. And when I would spend time with my Aunt Laura, and she was 100 at the time she would babysit me, and when she would talk to me, I couldn't write anything down. I had to listen. Write it in your head, because no one will take anything away from you if you remember. And every Sunday, we go to church, we talk about many moons. I remember when my mother told me when Sherman came through, because my great-great Aunt Laura was born in 1870. So having this experience is priceless, and I didn't know what they were preparing me for. So this history has become a ministry from the point of genealogical perspective, because most people don't know how the census and Native American slavery wrote the Indians out of history. The census played a key role. Before 1850, they only had 3 colours on the census. 3 white male, 3 white women, slaves, and 3 persons of color. So everybody else who wasn't white was other than white. So a lot of the natives became colored. And in the midst of becoming colored, and later down the line, the 1-drop blood rule came to play in the 1930 census. But in 1924, when the Native Americans became citizens of the United States, they also came out with a Racial Integrity Act. And all of the natives that appeared to have 1 drop of African blood became Negro and could no longer be classified as Indian according to the law. Now you can find this in the U.S. Census. Just search 1930. I have it in the PowerPoint. I'll go for you later. And that explains how a lot of natives today are under the umbrella of African American, and some of them don't even have any ancestry with African at all. But my family over the years, they've married African, we have European, we have Mexican, we have Asian. But one thing I learned about history, and if you want to solve the race problem in America and understanding, it's through history of telling it correctly, and we'll solve those problems. My grandmama, Ethel, she was a piece of cake. She was about 4'11". But when I would go see my grandmother, she taught me spiritual powers. And my grandmother Ethel, in 1972, we lived about a mile from her. Her sister, Aunt Susie, lived maybe from here to that wall. But my grandmother Ethel wanted no running water in her house. She wanted no electricity. She couldn't stand to listen to the radio. She couldn't stand to watch TV. Didn't want it. At night, she would put a bedpan next to her bed. And she would say, babies, come over here and read to me. So she had a candle, so we would read to her. But in the morning, she would take her urine, and her backyard looked like a golf course. It don't smell. She said, baby, I'm giving it back to Mother Earth. And that's what she did every morning. And my grandmother Ethel, whenever it would start thundering and lightning, she would go to chant. Nothing ain't gonna rain today. And it would stop. So having these experiences from the spiritual standpoint meant a lot, because Native people for the longest time that remained in the South, that didn't go west, had to study and practice their faiths in the church. So even though my family was Christian, they didn't become Christianized. So if you went to Asbury AME Church and saw a Holy Ghost dance, you would see the ghost dance. And most folks don't understand it. When my grandfather had a top hat and had a feather in the side, that was his chief hat. So in the Native American families that had stayed in the South, the medicine man became the preacher, the chief became an officer or a deacon in the church. That is a history that's not talked about, but we as a family know it well. And my mama, when my mother died in my arms. But let me explain something to y'all. And this is very important. When it comes to death, that is nothing but a bridge to cross over. 2 weeks after we buried my mom, she was standing in my living room looking at me, and I thought I was crazy. Her spirituality, and I have some pictures here I'll show you, because a lot of times when a lot of my friends and family don't believe me, and I'm okay, get the camera. And see, where did that come from? So I record those things. So Mom was there, but 2 weeks before Mom passed, my grandmother Ethel came to see me to prepare. And I don't know if anyone ever smelled death. It's a funny looking little smell. Death came to my house twice, and it came the morning my mother passed, and I was practicing my magic, and I was battling death. When I thought my mother was okay, I blew out my candles, and my mother passed, because I wanted to keep her here longer than she wanted to stay. Oftentimes now, in my dreams, I go and visit my ancestors. And you can do that if you're spiritually conscious. And everything is fine with them, and I do it often. So a lot of the spiritual techniques and practices, I inherited. For a while I didn't want them. But sometimes I can't tell a ghost from a walking person. But I learned to get rid of the fear and just embrace and to love. The Yuchi Indians are a unique people. My dad, when we were small, have anybody ever seen a blue jay? You mess with a blue jay and that's you in trouble. Well, the blue jay was in the plum bush. So what my dad did, my dad had the ability to talk to the birds. And he'd whistle, and the bird would move from the nest, and I would go pick the plums. My dad had a way of talking to fish, and we were fishing on the river. And other folks would get upset and want to fish in our spot, because we were catching fish, and they wouldn't catch fish. So my dad moved to another spot, sent 2 or 3 little chats, and we fishing over here, and someone come in that spot and don't catch anything. Because my dad knew how to communicate with the animals. And these practices stayed with you. So my family, growing up in the community, maintained our native principles. And for many people, that would seem to be so difficult to do, but they stayed with the ancestors. We go out in the country sometime, and my dad said, go lay down in the field. Why do you want me to lay down in the field? I'd lay down in the field, and I'd listen to the voices in the wind. What do you hear? You take me walking through the woods, what do you hear? You hear the leaves? That was his way of getting me in touch with nature. And sometimes now, when I'm at home in Claremont, I got a tree in my backyard. I get up 2 o'clock in the morning sometime, in my birthday suit, and go hug the tree. Because you get healings from trees. We've been so out of touch with nature. So what my family gave me is priceless. And as my mother said, I'm not going to leave you any money, but I'm going to leave you a legacy. My mother was in a state of dementia one day. And this is something y'all should be very aware of. When you have elders or family members in the state of dementia, it's very wise sometimes to look at it from a spiritual perspective. I got a blessing listening to my mother. And my mother started talking, I started writing. So she called some names. When she called the name, wrote it down, I called the National Archives. Excuse me. I sent them my family tree. They sent me my grandfather's plaque that met with King George. All listened to my mother in a state of dementia. Because many a times we try to medicate them, but that is a spiritual journey. And I always recommend, if you have any elders around your home and they go into that state of dementia, look at it from a spiritual perspective. Because they can tell you things. My mom had a stroke. And in her stroke, her right side was paralyzed. And the doctor said she'd never be able to use this side again. We came home, Scriven County. We have a cemetery called Big Oak. Right now it's owned by Wade Plantation. My grandfather, Titus McClare, one time in history, we used to bury our family at the house. So my grandfather was like a spirit keeper. So when we stopped burying them under the house, we buried them in the backyard. My mother, that raised me from 3 days old, used to play out there as a child. So I took Mom there. She's walking with a walker. She said, baby, help me out. She didn't want no shoes on. I got my mother out of the car, gave her the walker. She took 5 steps and threw the walker aside because she was back on her ancestral grounds that had made her whole again. These are the spiritual things of my family that has been with us for years. And that's some of the stories, experiences of the Yuchi Indians. I'm going to keep this short and brief. So now I'm going to go into a few of the PowerPoints and tell you some of the laws. Let's see. This is 5 bucks. Let me speed this up. Here's the act in 1682. Repeal the former law. Acts 2, November 1887. Join Native Americans and Africans, one category as Negro. This is why a lot of Indians are Negro today, but that's colonial law. Who and whose parents in native countries are not Christian at the time? In those days, Native Americans and even Africans who were enslaved, if you convert to Christianity, they baptized you and set you free. Here's a judge era. I'm just going to skim through this because buying time. I'm going to give you this PowerPoint to take with you to read over. Status of Negro rights and ability. This is South Carolina Negro law here, and it says the Act of 1740, Section 1, declare all Negroes and Indians, free Indians in amenity with this government, Negroes, mulattoes, mestizos, who are now free except be slaves, offsprings follow the condition of the mother. So, now I'm going to speak to you briefly from a genealogical perspective. When you're researching your ancestors and you come across mulatto, don't just think many a times it's just white and black. Because from a Spanish perspective, mulatto is an African or a native offspring. That's a mulatto. But that's also in Spanish a sambo. But it's also a maroon. And it's also a blackfoot. So if many of your ancestors say that they're Cherokee Blackfoot, you're dealing with the offspring of an African and an Indian. So those things to keep in mind. I need to get to the other PowerPoint here. I'm going to go the Mulatto Factory in South Carolina, the Act of 1740, 1848, Chapter 2, Slaves, Civil Rights, Abilities, Liabilities, and Abilities. Section 4, the issue of a mulatto is a Negro, the issue of a white woman and a Negro is a mulatto. And what you got to understand, this deals with South Carolina. Virginia is going to tell you the issue of a mulatto is an Englishman and a Negro woman. So when you're searching, you have to understand these laws when you go back in time and research your ancestors. That's very key with genealogy. A lot of people run into roadblocks sometimes. Well, they say my ancestor's black, they say my ancestor's white, and it's not right. Well, it could be right if you take time to go look at the laws. Because 200 years ago, I tell a story sometime of 3 Yuchi women. And these 3 sisters, one married European, one married Indian, one married white. So all 3 children became mulatto, and one became an Indian mulatto because he didn't marry back in the tribe. But that mulatto child has a decision to marry back white or marry back black. So 200 years ago, you might have a black ancestor, or you might have a white ancestor, and everybody's white today, everybody's black today. That's the beauty of genealogy. But when you open, you don't have any roadblocks, and that's the blessing of it. So if you could help me pull up another PowerPoint, I want to show some pictures because I'm going to speed this up. I want to get one pictures. Okay. Here's a census report taken. Indian Negroes with the Army of Florida. And many people don't know the Seminoles don't originate in Florida. The Seminoles come off the Savannah River. Because the Seminoles is the mixture of remnants of tribes. They're Muskogee, they're Yuchi, they're Savannah, they're Coney, they're Omogi. They're the remnants and went down to Florida. But they called them Indian Negroes. Now let me show you some pictures. Okay. There is a place called Palaciola, and it's right down the road. And Palaciola is now Scriven County and Allendale County. Let me blow this up. How can I make this bigger?